Hi, I am Alfonso Muchacho. I am a DJ and music producer, not a YouTuber. And today I'm going to take you through one of my latest tracks called Stop Pushing Me. This track is quite simple on the surface, but I want to explain why all the elements work together the way they do and my thought process behind each one. So let's dive right in. First of all, we'll start with the kick drum, which is the least interesting part of any track. It's very dry, it's punchy, that's about it. More of these types of drums are available in my sample pack, link below. But I always like to get a kick drum that just doesn't get in the way of the mix, makes it quite short, good attack, really quick kind of decay, so I have a lot more room for the bass line. The bass line is a little bit more interesting, so what I've done here is I have combined a couple of elements together to make the bass line. So the first element you can hear here is a 808, tuned 808 from Battery. I use this a lot when I want my bass line to not be too melodic. It's more of a percussive sound. Obviously an 808 drum is all about transients. For me, I'm not a hip hop producer. A lot of transients, so it bounces off the kick. So if you listen to that and the kick, it's this constant chugga 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 movement, and it's the sort of thing that will hit you in the chest in the club, but it doesn't get in the way of all the melodic elements, and it's not something that I have to make space for it. It just exists as kind of like a counterpoint to the kick drum. In addition to that, we have a bass shot. Not really interesting, but combined with combining it with the very dull 808, if you were, it gives it a little bit more melodic information, I guess you would say. The track is quite an organic sounding track, as in all of the instruments and percussion, they don't sound digital at all. They sound like they could be like a real string or a real instrument kind of playing, and this is more of like an electronic sound. That's how I hear it in my mind. It gives a kind of like a different counterpoint to all the sounds that could exist in the real world. This sounds like something that couldn't exist in the real world, so it makes it sound a little bit more like an electronic music track. In terms of processing, on the Battery I've got FabFilter's Saturn, which I just use it on the default setting just to give it a bit more oomph, a limiter, and then I've used Track Spacer here, which is side chained to that more electronic bass shot, so when that kicks in, the 808 toms really duck down. This is so when both are playing at the same time, the priority is given to that bass shot rather than the tom, so it really feels like that's the main focal point, and that's the part of the bass line that cuts through. With the side chaining on as it is, it will really make the bass shot stand out because the 808 gets ducked quite a lot. So it really feels like you've got this constant offbeat counterpoint to the kick drums. You've got dum da dum 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 da dum dum, and then when the bass shot comes in, the rest of the bass kind of like ducks to allow that to come through, so it makes it sound bigger than it actually is. On the group, we have a limiter, and that's it. So really keeping it simple. I like to keep my bass lines simple. The more complicated you make them and the more processing you put on them, I find the more messes you can get into. I don't really go into huge melodic moments in my bass lines because I save that for the melodic elements. If you make a bass line that has lots of different notes and it plays a really intricate melody, your options are limited further down the line when you come to write chords and arps and all that kind of stuff, because you've already got so much melodic information already present in your track. Now, talking of the melodics, what do we have here? Let's go from top to bottom. So this is a group I made that is kind of like this aggressive stabbing sound. And that is two elements. So the first one, we have analog, which is just a noise. You can see here it's nothing super exciting. It's just the noise element at the top. And then underneath it we have Serum, which is the rest of it. And that's just a bass preset. So together, and it's just that injection of something grabs your attention. So along with kind of like the same sort of idea with the bass shot that I've just explained, is something like to grab your attention, because the track itself is, well, I'll play you the drop so you know what it sounds like.
We won't last forever.
So the chord stabs there are quite repetitive, and they kind of run for the entirety of the track. So you need something to interject, to make an injection of something different, to make the track break from the pattern that it's following, so that you're not just... It's okay making a synth line quite hypnotic and repetitive, but it can get boring very quickly, and you've only got a couple of minutes of grace with an audience before they get a bit annoyed. So I think having these stabs here kind of jolts you out of the hypnotic kind of melody, and it just makes it a little bit more interesting. So we come down to the chords. I call them stabs here, but they're really chords. There's two of them that I've stacked on top of each other here. See, I've got a lot of automation going on with the filter FM, the release. I've also automated, obviously, the filter. This is the same as what's been played underneath. So it's a couple of saws. Couple of octaves apart. And what I've done underneath here is I've just moved it down an octave. And I've done a lot less automation on that part of the track, because that's more of the fundamental of the sound, and then obviously this one above here is where all the intensity comes from. But over the course of the track, they just kind of duck and weave between each other. I let them interact with each other and kind of bounce off each other. Just if you had one of these playing all the way through, it would become a bit uninteresting. And this bottom one down here gives a little bit of thickness to the sound. The one at the top gives a little bit more excitement and urgency, and weaving them in and out in the track, even if it's not in a way that makes like a big moment or a big drop or anything like that, just the constant interplay with them moving around slightly between each other gives you the impression that the sound is a lot more complex, bigger, thicker, more interesting than if you just had one of them playing on their own. So down here we have the Vox group, which is just the a cappella. You can hear it here.
Said that you stop pushing me. You said that you stop pushing me. You said that you stop pushing me. We won't last forever.
We won't go too much into the a cappella for copyright reasons, but we can have a look at the processing. So you hear the strange kind of like pitched noise on top of the a cappella. That all comes from Portal. So as that's brought in, you hear more of these strange artifacts as it builds. So it normally sounds like this.
Pushing me. You said that you stop pushing.
When Portal's on, it sounds like this.
Pushing me. Said that you stop pushing me.
It gives an otherworldly effect, and because it's only a couple of words, you need to make them a bit more interesting. If it just said, you said that you stop pushing me for 4 minutes, you're going to get quite bored of hearing her say that. But with Portal adding these extra like strange little chipmunk noises, I think it gives this otherworldly effect, makes it a lot more interesting. I think that's the theme of this track. Very few elements, making them more interesting. Rather than adding in a whole load of new melodies and new ideas, I really tried to have a basis of maybe 5 or 6 different core elements, and then making them interesting for 6 minutes and 40 is where the skill, as it were, comes in, and that's done by all this automation, all this weaving of the sounds. The strings are kind of the more emotional part of the track, so they start off like this. And that's from Selena. I've stacked a couple of Selenas on top of each other. Very simple pattern. I played it in myself, as you can tell, and it's just a part of the track where there's not a lot of strings playing throughout the track. I try to keep it quite sparse. I'm trying not to rely on pads and that kind of thing to make the track sound more dense. I want to keep it stripped back. But in the breakdown, this is where the chords and the melodies kind of come through, and it builds into this crescendo, which I think is quite nice. So the whole of the breakdown sounds like this. It's just a bit of a break from the chugging kind of rhythmic section that's present in before and after, so it's a real juxtaposition to the rest of the track. In terms of processing on these, bit of EQ on both, no, on one, and then the group I have Pro Q, and all that does is kind of automates the roll off at the top and the bottom. Not that interesting. A little bit of Saturn. One of the presets sounded good. This preset here, the 456 Demo MDB, sounds really good on strings and pads. It's a quite mid-range and upper end kind of focused. It really makes them jump out. So I rely on that a lot to make strings and pads cut through the mix. Bit of limiting, and that's it. Very simple. So let's go down here. What else we got? We got more noise, but this is just a noise builder, and then it reverses. So I've got a string here, which is just a high string. So-called bicep string, because I sampled it out of a bicep record. The Garden Birds is a bit more interesting. Have a listen to this on its own. So I wouldn't think that that was a sound of my garden, but it is, with a load of effects on. And what I did with that is I automated, well, there's a load of effects on it, as you can see, but I automated the shifter and made the pitch rise, and then used the spectral resonator to bring it back down again. So you have this weird effect where it's a sound that can't exist anywhere else. No one else has got that sample, only me, because I recorded it outside here with the birds singing. And then having this kind of inharmonic, unnatural sound playing over the sound of seagulls, apparently, kind of brings this like building, strange, swelling noise. And then I bring it right back down here with the resonator dropping down. So take a listen to the whole thing. What I like about that is just with a little bit more effort you get so much more out of this transition that I've made here, kind of out of this the beginning stages of this track. If I'd have just gone for a riser sound out of a sample pack or some sort of builder, everyone's got that and they sound a little bit cheesy, right? It's like a whoosh, like a rocket taking off and like, oh wow, like it really does sound to me like you've just dropped it into a track. Like you've got it out of a sample pack and just dropped it in and you haven't put any effort into it. But this sound here, it probably took me, I don't know, 10 minutes to make, but it doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. No one else has it. And it sounds so complex and it sounds tuned to the track. Because I've automated the filter here, I've put the delay in just the right amount at the end. It's built to this track. It's for the right time, the right pitch, the right moment. If I'd have just gone into a sample pack and dropped something in, it wasn't made for the track, and I find that they can kind of stand out in a way that isn't pleasant. You know, when you just hear a crash from a 909, someone's just dropped in, and you're like, ah, you could have put like 5 minutes more effort into that, and it would have sounded cohesive as part of the music. And this sounds cohesive and part of this track because I put it into the track and made it fit and constructed this build within the context of the rest of the sounds that are playing, so it sounds like it belongs. But if I'd have just dropped something in, it would have stuck out in the wrong ways. Ah, I like it. Garden Birds. Right, percussion. Let's have a look down here. This is quite simple. We'll go from the top, the ride. I always like to drop a ride in, a part of the track that needs a little bit more urgency, like a crescendo. It's a 909 ride. I'm going to go back on what I just said about 909 crashes. I think the 909 ride, open hi-hats and closed hi-hats, are a staple of house and techno music, and they just always sound good. Maybe because they're so familiar, but they always sound good to me. Turn the release down slightly, but that hasn't really affected it. I always transpose them up by usually 1 or 2, just because I think they fit into the track better. And what have I done here? A bit of oh yes, here's some absolutely next level EQing. Just to cut off some of the body down there. Limiting again. Okay, so the right loop and the left loop. Let's have a listen to those. They'll probably be a little bit more interesting than the ride. That's playing on the right and this is playing on the left. And to me, that's what the entire track is. Those 2 melodic loops there with the bass sound interjecting is what the whole soul of the track is about. These are quite important. They carry the track through basically the whole of the timeline. I think they run from beginning to end. Yes, they run from the spine of the entire track. And because they're quite melodic, they're very pleasant to listen to. But because they're quite melodic, it really limits the amount of melodies and room you've got in the melodic section. Hence why my stabs are so kind of rhythmic and simple. It's kind of all you can get away with when you've got the melodic percussive parts playing. Any more than that and it gets a bit confusing, it becomes overwhelming for the listener. So your choices when you're making your bass line and you're making your percussive elements really impact the melodic parts. I kind of construct them a lot of the time the different way around. So I will make my melodic parts first, which then leads me to make decisions later on about the percussion, because I know how much room I've got or how much room I haven't got. In this case, I think I worked from the percussive bits, the right loop and the left loop first, and then went back and made the stabs over the top, because I knew I was restricted to that amount of information that I could fit into the track. If I'd have gone in with a huge arpeggiated sequence, loads of complex chords, that kind of thing, it just wouldn't work with these 2 rhythmic percussive sounds, because they've got so much melodic information in them. So what have we got down here? Left hats and right hats. I think I've labelled these appropriately. Again, complementing each other. Hats, and I think the right one's more of a shaker, isn't it? Yeah, I'd class that as a shaker. So you've got 2 kind of different sounds there. The hats are quite metallic, they're quite full, they've got a lot of information lower down in the frequency spectrum, and they have lots of transients in them. The shakers obviously are very different. They sit higher up, more hissing, and because they're a shaker they don't have like this hard transient that hits. So when you're combining these 2, they complement each other quite well, because you've got a lower down, more transient bass sound in the hats, and you've got a more hissing, softer sound in the shakers. Stick them on top of each other. You've got a loop that sounds like it's one loop and it belongs together. The only other part is the clap, which I believe I recorded in. The percussive elements get very simple treatment, as you can see. That's all I'm doing with the clap, very little. I really believe that with hats, shakers, claps, you pick the right one. We're so lucky these days that we have access to so many different samples and sample packs and methods of getting the right sound in. I don't think you should be struggling with EQ, processing and all that kind of stuff, trying to make them work in your track. Just pick the right one. In the old days when you only had maybe like one drum machine, you had a 909. I understand why people went to huge lengths to try and manipulate those sounds and make them fit into tracks and make them sound new and original, because there was very little in the way of like samples, all that kind of stuff. You might have a sample CD which you would use the same 10 hats and claps on for all of your percussion parts and all of your tracks. But today we have such unlimited choice in the amount, breadth, scope, variety of all these kind of strange instruments that we can pull on and basic stuff like claps, just pick the right one to go into your track. If you've got a chain of like an EQ, a delay, a compressor, a saturator, a resonator, some sort of shifter, and you're using dynamic EQ and you're pitching all these things around to try and make them fit in the track, you've probably gone too far and you just haven't picked the right thing. So I like, with all of these percussive elements, and we're hearing playing together, they're all basically as they sounded when they were recorded. Across all of these, you've got EQ, you've got a little bit of saturation here, EQ, EQ. I've used redux as an effect there at certain parts, going to change the sound, like building up to like a drop or some sort of climax. And the same with the hats, it's just EQ. They're very simple, very organic, and they're the right sounds for the track, and they didn't take a lot of work to get in. That being said, to contradict myself, I am quite a fan of using hats, claps, shakers, all that kind of stuff as an effect, and really going to town on them and then going crazy and putting them through like a load of different effects, but more as an effect, something to build and cause a transition and to change the mood of the track at a certain point, not something that's playing rhythmically over the entirety of the track. I'm a firm believer that the track should work, or the percussive elements should work because they're the right percussive element. It's the same with the kick. The kick, I picked a kick and I used it. I don't understand why people spend 45 minutes having a bottom kick, a mid kick and a top kick and combining them all and try and get them to work together in a track. Just pick the right kick. There's so many kicks out there in the world. There's so many samples. There's so many places you can go and get a good kick drum from. If you're layering 3 different kick drums and you're trying to make them work together, which by the way could take an hour of your time, when you could have been creating, you could have been in creative mode, making melodies in the flow, doing interesting things, but you've been sidetracked by making a kick from scratch that doesn't really work. And when you're stacking things like kicks on top of each other, you've really got to understand how the phase interplays with each other, and just a slight millisecond shift in the beginning of a sample can really make things like cancel each other out, and then you've got to try and fix it with EQ. And then what type of EQ are you using? Are you using a zero latency EQ? Are you using a linear phase EQ? Do you understand what pre-ringing is? All these kinds of like strange, not esoteric, but technical concepts come into play. Whereas what you could have done is you could have done what I've done here and picked a kick. There we go. There's a kick in the track. I didn't need to make it. And you can see how the kick looks here in the waveform. It's simple. It works. I haven't used any EQ on it. I haven't used any limiting, any compression, nothing to shape it, because I picked the right kick in the first place. And that's what this track, as I'm explaining it here, I'm realizing this track is so simple because I've just picked the right elements to work with each other, and I haven't battled against it trying to fit them all in. On the sends, Valhalla Room, I think I've used it slightly at different times as an effect. I've used a little bit of chorus. What goes through the chorus? The bass stab sound, I believe. No, it's the toms. So what I've done there is just to make them a bit wider. So I really like to break a few rules here and there, and making a wide bass line is one of them. But what I've done, I've rolled off all the low end here. So you've got the tom is straight down the middle, and then the send is combining a little bit of chorused tom to make it sound, and you can see I've set it 100% to the side here just to make it sound a little bit wider, but the main element is straight down the middle. And then you've got this kind of like this wider sound out to the sides just to make it fill out the mix a little bit. I use H delay on certain elements. This is as exciting as it got. At one moment in the track. I like H delay. It's very simple and easy to use and simple to understand. It needs to be, because I can't be bothered with spending 45 minutes trying to figure out the delay settings on something. This is such a wonderful plugin because it sounds good and it's got a few parameters. You just need to learn the delay and the feedback and change a few of these if you want to get fancy, and that's it. It's great to use. So in terms of processing on the master channel, all I've got here is I've used a bit of EQ at moments. Let's see what I've done here. This is just to roll off the bass information in the breakdown. I do this in most of my tracks just so that when the drop comes in, it sounds more impactful because you're missing a lot of the information that's been below 100 down here. So I have smart limit here on the master channel, and I don't have this on. This isn't like the final master. This is something I just put on when I'm producing so that I can hear kind of what it will sound like when it's at that loud mastering stage. I know that I want my tracks to maybe max out at about -8 LUFS short term. So what I do is I set this up and see how much gain reduction it will take to get there. So you can see there I was approaching maybe -8.4, which is in the ballpark of what I want the final master to kind of sit at. And you can see, if you look at the gain reduction, it's costing me about maybe -4, -5 at times dB of gain reduction. So I know I can kind of get this track to the loud stage by using 5 or 6 dB of gain reduction. Now, if I was bringing this down by say 5 or 6 dB and I was only hitting maybe -10 LUFS, I know I've got more work to do and go back into the track to make it louder on individual parts and in groups. Because if I export this and it's not that loud, it's not as loud as I've just tested here, in the mastering stage, I'm stuck in this compromise between I can't get the track loud enough because I don't want to shave off that much of gain reduction in the mastering stage, and I wish I could go back and change it. And you're kind of in this weird position where it's not loud enough, but you haven't got the dynamics, and now you're stuck and you don't really know what to do. So I stop that happening by doing this test. I see how much of gain reduction I'm going to need to get it to that competitive level, and if I'm nowhere near loud enough, what I will then go back and do is on the groups I will add a little bit more limiting to bring the gain reduction down on these bits, because it's a lot easier to reduce individual sounds and melodic parts. You see I've got all the melodies going on an L2 here as well, where they're getting -3 dB of gain reduction. Now let's say I wasn't hitting my targets with smart limit, I could just bring all of these down by a couple more dB, and that's a way better way of getting loudness than it is trying to squash the master down. Because in the mastering stage, what you're doing is you're basically limiting the kick drum by another 5 dB, right? Because the kick drum should always be the loudest part of your track, and if you need to bring your entire track down by, let's say, 6 dB to make it louder, you're basically bringing the transient of the kick drum down by about that much. And it's a lot easier to go back into the group stage here. The bass line here, you can see I'm taking -3 off, so the melodies I was taking about the same off. If I needed to find another 3 or 4 dB of loudness from somewhere, I could just go back into these groups and bring them all down slightly, and then I know my master limiter wouldn't need to work that hard in the mastering stage, because I can see how much I need to pull it down by to hit about -8 LUFS. With this track, I was quite happy with how it sounded as it was. It's because it's quite a punchy rhythmic track, like the bass line and the kick remind you what they sound like. It's transient based. It's a rolling, punchy, transient based track. I don't want to squish it too much. I don't want to make it like -7 LUFS at the mastering stage, because you'll lose that punchiness. That's what drives this track. All of these melodic elements are loud enough. I believe it works fine as it is. So what I would have done here is I would have exported it into a 32-bit WAV file and then bring it back into its own mastering session, where I maybe would have used a little bit of saturation, a little bit of EQ if there was some problem frequencies, but I probably would have fixed them here, and then a little bit of limiting at the end. I think the track hits about -8.2 LUFS anyway at the mastering stage, so it's not something that I haven't sacrificed any loudness, but the track itself is based around transients, so you don't want to squish them too much, otherwise it will just sound flat.